Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our third BraunWeiss Team Talks, our informational webinar and Q&A hosted by BraunWeiss Management Consulting Group. Today's presentation will be on business analyst framework and methodologies. At BraunWeiss, we specialize in business strategy, customer experience, technology, customer experience and technology implementations, digital transformation, and finance and accounting operational excellence. We were founded in 2014 and are located in the greater Boston area. Today's webinar of business analysis framework and methodologies will be presented by Camila, our lead business analyst, and I, Chetan Durham, will be today's host. If anyone has any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to type them in the Q&A chat, and I'll ask the questions to Camila throughout our presentation. Camila, again, thank you for being here, and let's go ahead and get this started.
Well, great. Thank you, Chetan, for having me with you today, and thanks to everyone for joining us. This is very exciting, and I'm very excited to talk about business analysis methodologies. So let's get started. In summary, business analysts are the driving force for a lot of different projects, and their main responsibility is to help clients understand their business better, but then also help clients to imagine how their business could look like in the future. And here I just want to talk about the role itself, and before going into different aspects of the role, I just wanted to mention that as a business analyst, you should have solid hard and soft skills. And then by hard skills, I mean they should be able to utilize different technology that you might need to use throughout the project. And then you should also be good at communicating with different teams within the project, because communication is key to every successful project. So business analysts are very good at communicating, because they also deal with a lot of documentation. And I'm going to start talking about a role a little bit. So what business analysts essentially do is they help their client to understand their organization better. And it starts with business analysts doing some research about their client's company. They go on a company's website to see what the clients are doing, what they're offering, either it's a service or a product, and basically what kind of image the client is sending to their clients. And then they also do some research to understand how customers of these clients picture these clients in their head. So, and business analysts do that to make sure that whatever the client thinks of themselves is the same as what the customer thinks of the client, just to ensure that there's no misalignment in there. And then another thing that they do is they help business analysts help the clients to understand the market. Where is the market going? What are some of the trends that are appearing in the market? And along with that, they do some competitor research so that they can share it with the client to give them a better idea of what's happening in the industry overall. And then the next step is just interacting with stakeholders. Throughout your project, you're going to be meeting different people, different stakeholders are going to be engaged within the project. And what business analysts do essentially is they ask clarifying questions, they communicate with stakeholders, they lead meetings with them, they prepare presentations. So basically driving this engagement from the client. And by doing that, they're able to first of all, gather the necessary requirements that are needed for the project, but then they're also able to utilize this information that's coming from the interactions and use it in documenting different requirements that we're going to go over in this presentation later. And the last part that is also important is just interacting with your project team. And by that, I mean that business analysts act as a liaison between the client's team and their own project team. And it's business analysts' responsibility to ensure that both the client and their project team are on the same page so that they can go ahead and start working on the project itself.
Camila, before we move on here, I got a couple of questions in the Q&A chat. The first one is there a difference in the day-to-day roles of a business analyst depending on the type of consulting firm?
Sure. So I want to say that the firm that business analysts are working for, like they're not driving the context for business analysts. What's driving the day-to-day activities is the type of project that they're engaged in. And one example I can think of, if you're working as a business analyst for a technology firm, you might be put on a project that deals with implementing technology for a healthcare client. So what business analysts would do is they would bring their expertise and knowledge that they have about the healthcare industry and utilize this knowledge in helping the client to achieve the desired results. So instead of looking at it as business analysts is working within this firm, it's what kind of expertise business analyst has or either can acquire within the specific project and then bring this knowledge into the project itself.
Okay, also I have another question here. Anonymous writes, what are some common tools for understanding the organization?
Yeah, so some of the common tools is just, well, basically the best thing you can do is Google the organization online. Right. So what I usually do when I'm trying to understand a client organization, I would go on their website, see what they have, and then I would just track the organization on different platforms for different resources. So for example, for a different company, you can look them up online. You can also look them up on LinkedIn. If they're active on any other social media, you can look them up there. But as soon as you do this research, it gives you a better understanding of your client's organization and the message that they have on their website versus other social platforms that they engage in.
Okay, great. That's all the questions I have from now.
Great. So the next thing that I want to talk about is project engagement, and this is just a life cycle that business analysts usually follow. So just going back to the question that we had, the first and the most important thing is understand your client's business, because the more you understand the business, the more questions you're going to come up with that you can ask during the interactions with your client. So what usually happens is business analysts understand their client's business, and then based on all of the information they find, they come up with clarifying questions. And then they come to a meeting with a client, they get all the necessary information, they interact with the client, and then they move on to the next stage, which is documentation. And documentation includes drafting requirements documentation and other helpful documentation that the team and the business analyst might use throughout the project. And the documentation is primarily driven by all of the conversations that business analyst has with the client in the beginning stages. And then after you document everything, business analysts treat the document as a written contract between the client and the project team, so that if anything goes wrong, the business analyst, the project manager, and the client can go back to the document and look at all the requirements that they came up with and the requirements that they agreed to. So the next step after documentation is just collaboration. And by that, I mean collaborating with your own team and collaborating with your business stakeholders. And it's important to note that business analysts do not work on their own. They're always engaged in working with their team, because that's the only way of moving forward and delivering a good project. So as soon as they collaborate and work with developers, other analysts, sometimes it could be engineers, they develop a product. And after that stage passes, you move on to the testing phase, which is a stage where business analysts, together with the developer and the rest of the team, they test the solution that was just developed. And after the solution is tested internally, the team passes on testing to a client. And then after everything works together, we move together to the training stage. And in the training stage, what happens is you train a client and help the client to understand how to use a new product. And the main goal of this stage is just to ensure that whenever your project goes live, your client is ready to maintain the project on their own and you pass on the project to the client.
Great. Before we move on here, I got a couple of questions. The first one from Ravi. He asked, how do I interact with a client that is not engaging?
That's a good question. So I think you have to understand why the client is not engaging within the project. Is it maybe he's not interested, maybe he's too busy, or just try to get an understanding of what's happening with the client. If they're not engaging within the project, then you're not going to be driving the project and pressuring the client into taking on this project. So the best way of moving forward would be to have the conversation with the client and make sure that the client understands that you have other projects going on in the pipeline, and then maybe find another stakeholder from the client's team who has more time and resources to take on and become the lead from the stakeholder, from the client team.
Okay, I also have another question from Victor. Victor writes, in SDLC, what % of involvement is required for a BA?
Well, I want to just say that BA is present throughout the entire software development lifecycle, because BAs, business analysts, are huge on documentation. And for every stage of the software cycle development, you should have different documentation. So if anything goes not according to the plan in the project, the person that the team is going to come to is going to be the business analyst, because business analyst essentially has the best understanding of the business among the entire team. And if any technical issues arise, people always can refer to business analyst, so that the business analyst can take a look at the documentation, talk together to the project manager, and figure out the next steps.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. I have a few more questions here. Our chat's blowing up, which is great. The first question that I have is there anything specifically we need to pay attention to while training the clients?
Yeah, definitely. And as I mentioned earlier, the training stage is very important. So the best way of training a client would be to come up with a training strategy where you have a session with your client, but instead of just giving them tons of videos and training manuals, you interact the client. So like you give clients the ability to go and play around with the new product that you've created. And by driving this interactive activities and letting the client engage in it, the client's going to get a better understanding of the new product. The client's going to be able to ask better questions. And yeah, and then another thing that I think is really important is identify someone from the client's team who has the necessary skills or can acquire the necessary skills to take the responsibility of maintaining the new product. So you can't train everyone from the client side, right? You just want to train the most important stakeholders, and then someone who is going to be taking on the new project and maintaining it after you as a team step down.
Okay, I also have another question here. This is from Anonymous. They write, how would you handle situations where the requirements of a project change after the contract is drafted and signed?
Well, that's the thing, because the contract is already drafted and it's already signed. So you already have a sign off from the client. But if the requirements just keep changing and they're not mentioned in the original business requirements document, you should just talk with your project manager to see if the requirements fit within the scope or not, and then go back to the documentation. And if it's not mentioned in this documentation, you would have to talk with the client and just be very honest about it. Say that it's not in the master service agreement, it's not in the statement of work, and it just doesn't fall under our responsibility to deliver on this. And just pass this responsibility, because no one was talking about it when you had a contract.
Okay, that's very informative. One last question before we move on here. Amy writes, who is responsible for testing in a project?
Well, ultimately, the entire team is responsible, and it starts with the developer. So whatever the developer builds, he or she should be able to go ahead and start testing on their own. After that testing is done, it's going to be passed on to a business analyst. Sometimes there are quality assurance teams, and then you can engage, like in the last step of the process, you can engage the entire team so you can test collectively, and you can then have your client to do a test. But I also have a slide here in this deck, which I'm going to go into later, just describing different testing phases and who is responsible for conducting what kind of testing.
Okay. I don't think we have any more live questions for now if you want to continue on.
Sure, that's great. So I also wanted to mention a couple of sample artifacts that business analysts are responsible for. And as I was mentioning before, business analysts are huge on documentation. For every step of a project, you have a certain document. So the requirements document include the business requirements, and business requirements is just a document that summarizes the high-level overview of the project, what is going to be achieved within the project, what is the final solution going to be looking like, what approach is going to be taking when executing this project, and what are some of the needs of the users to whom the project is going to be delivered to. And then we also have functional requirements document, which is a document that talks about different capabilities and functionalities that are going to be in the final product itself. So this document is very helpful for a developer because it serves as a guide and like a plan of what the developer is going to be developing within a solution. And it's a very good document, and it's very helpful because as soon as this documentation is drafted, the developer agrees to the capabilities that the team decides to include, and then you get a client sign off. So sometimes people and clients especially would ask for new things to be added that are outside of the scope. So developers and business analysts refer to this documentation and say that this specific requirement is falling outside of our scope and we are not going to be working on it. And then the last requirement documentation is user stories, and they're used in AGILE methodology. So user stories are just they're very short descriptions of a feature, and when business analysts write this short descriptions, they're usually writing from a perspective of someone who's going to be using this new capability. And then for visuals, it's important to create visuals so that they give the team, both the project team and the client team, a better understanding of what kind of things are going to be included in the project. So we have wireframes here, and wireframes are just it's just a document that shows some features like the layout. If you're doing a website, you would have the website navigation in there. So it just gives a brief idea of how the project is going to look like and what's the layout going to be. For process flows, this documentation and visual specifically is going to be talking about what are some of the processes that are in place and how they're working, what's happening behind the scenes. And then we also like to design process flows that help the clients to understand how different business processes are going to be looking like when the project is going to be delivered. And another visual is just mockups, and they're great tools for just giving a quick idea of how the product is going to look like. And sometimes mockups have some basic features that could be tested when a certain product is designed. And then going to testing, so there are different documents that are used for the testing. And the first one is test planning. So in test planning, you would just describe the software that's going to be used, and you're going to be talking about the general approach that's going to be taking when someone's going to be conducting testing. So it's just a high-level overview. Whereas, for example, for scripts, you would provide a set of instructions that are going to be performed on the system. And for test cases, there are just some different variables or functionalities that have to be met in order for the test to be passed. And then in the end of the testing, we have defect reports. So as soon as the testing is done, there are going to be some errors that are going to be uncovered throughout the process. And with these reports, business analysts would just use this document and pass it on to the developer. And this document is going to be very detailed, and it's going to be showing which things are not working within the solution. And the last one is training. So for training, business analysts could create short videos, like demo videos of how the product is working. They could also do training manuals, which are just very lengthy documents with snapshots, detailed instructions about how to use different things. And then we also have cheat sheets, which are just shortcuts for the most important functionality features.
Okay, so I only have one question here, and that question is, what are the tools or applications that you personally consider to be the most important to execute your projects as a business analyst?
I find all of these documents are very important, but what me and my team found very useful is just working on a platform such as like Microsoft Suite. So it has many capabilities. We can create our presentations. We can use Microsoft Visio to have some visuals. We can use Excel for manual testing, and of course the training could also be created in there. So it's just a good solution that's catering to all of the needs that business analysts have throughout the project.
Okay. One other question that just came in is from Anonymous. Which tool would you recommend to beginners for building wireframes and process flows?
The most simple one is PowerPoint. That's the one that I start, but it's very basic. And I would say that if you're starting, you can just have some just play around with it, play with different shapes that are available there. But I think the best tool is Visio, because it's pretty straightforward. It has all the needed functionalities, and it allows you to create different diagrams and flows and to easily connect them to each other.
So one last question that we got here, it's from Ted. He asked, why are process flows so important to a project?
Process flows?
Yes, process flows.
Yeah, so we use process flows, and we divide them into categories. We have as-is process flows, and what the business analyst essentially does for this is you go ahead and analyze any of the processes that your client currently has in their service or product, for example, and you show the client the process flows, and you say like, oh, this is how it's working, and you ask some clarification questions to make sure that you've captured the needed information. But then you also use in process flows to picture the to-be process. And when you provide this diagram to a client, you can see the client's reaction to the future process that you're going to be implementing for their business. So it ultimately gives the client a better visual understanding of what processes are going to be implemented in the future.
Okay, thanks for that explanation. We don't have any more questions for now, so you can carry on.
Sure. And I just wanted to talk about testing, and I remember we had a question about testing as well. So this is just a very detailed overview of how the testing is usually conducted. So it usually starts with the unit test, and by that I mean, so we have a developer who is working on one small part of the project, and as soon as he finishes this work, he's going to be conducting a test on it. And this test is conducted by a developer and just testing one small thing. But then the second step is assembly testing. And what happens there is you have a couple of developers who work in different parts and different parts of the, let's say, software. And then when you put it together, you need all the developers to test if all of the things that they've created separately now work well together. And then after that, we have functional testing, which is conducted by a business analyst. And what the goal of this testing is for business analysts to go ahead and start testing the system and see if all the functional requirements that were listed in the functional design document are met. So basically, all of the capabilities that we agreed to with the client are met or not. And then after that, you have system integration testing. And this testing is performed by the team. And what essentially is happening there is you've built out this whole new product and you need the project team to go ahead and start testing it. Start testing how efficiently and effectively all of the systems are integrated, if they're integrated, how well they're working with each other. And yeah, and then we also have QA. So after the team finishes testing the new solution, you have a quality assurance team, and this team is usually hired outside of the company, and they're coming to test the quality of the new solution. And then after that, we have UAT. So this is the testing that is conducted by a user, meaning someone from the client side, and you want to give them an opportunity to test because these are ultimately going to be the people who are going to be using your software on a daily basis. And that's it for the testing. But one thing that I wanted to mention is that as you go through all the stages, and let's say after you roll out a product, the client wants you to add something else, one small feature or something like that. When you add it, you would have to do regression testing. And regression testing is basically you're testing out this new feature and how it fits within the product that your team have already built. And what's important to keep in mind with testing is that you cannot proceed with different steps of testing if one thing fails. So let's say that you did unit testing and assembly testing, and then on functional testing, something failed. You cannot move to the next stage. It means that you have to start all over again, fix everything, and conduct testing step by step.
Great. So I've received a couple of questions while you were going over this slide. The first one is from Shishin. She writes, what are some common tools for the testing stage?
Sure. So first of all, there are two ways to do testing. One is manual, and by that I mean that you have a script that could be written in Excel, and you would go ahead and start testing manually based on all of the test cases and scenarios that you have in the Excel document. But then another testing is automated. So what you do is you go ahead and you use a software tool. One of the tools that is very popular right now is Selenium. So they use it, and this tool is basically conducting testing for you. And you just, as a user, you're just sitting back and seeing how the testing is performed by the software.
Okay, thank you for that. Steve also writes, what is the role of a BA in UAT?
Sure. So UAT is essentially the person who is preparing the internal documentation for their team. And then when the team finishes testing, this document is used for UAT. And business analyst responsibility is to go ahead, check that all of the internal documentation is correct, everything was fixed, it's working, and then they would clean up the SAT document, add some instructions for the users about how different testing works within the document, and they would pass this document on to a client who's going to be doing UAT testing.
Okay, great. So I don't have any more questions from my side. Let's carry on.
Great. And now I just want to talk about AGILE and what it means to be a BA within the AGILE framework. So what business analysts do is they kind of follow the same approach. They start with planning, and that includes doing some documentation, but instead of writing a lot of documents, they would create user stories. And then they would use this user stories to start designing the solution. And as soon as the design phase is done, they would move to developing, and this is where the business analyst works together with the developer to ensure that the development process just started and all of the features and functionalities that developers are going to be incorporating are going to be based on the user stories and some of the specifications that are mentioned within them. And then after that, you then go again into testing, and you first start with developers testing, then BAs are testing, and then the rest of the team is testing. And then after everything looks good, you release the product. But within Agile, the work is usually done in small increments. So they work in sprints, which are usually 2 weeks long. And business analysts within the Agile should be very flexible because they should know how to incorporate feedback. They should know how to be very flexible if the customer needs are changing, and they should just be very good at like keeping track of all the small pieces of documents that come here and there within the short sprint itself.
Okay, great. I just have one question here. Roberto writes, what Agile tools do you suggest using? Is there a specific software necessary to implement Scrum or Kanban in practice?
So usually the two tools that are very widely used are DevOps and Jira. And I have some experience working with Jira. It's a very nice software tool because it allows you to plan, track, and release work in sprints. And within Jira, you can create different dashboards. So you can create a Kanban dashboard with a team that's going to be working within Kanban framework, and then you can create a separate dashboard for Scrum as well.
Okay. Let's carry on. I don't think I have any more questions about Agile.
Sure, sounds good. And then moving on to waterfall planning. So the waterfall framework is it's a very step-by-step framework which emphasizes the sequential approach, which means that you have to do everything step by step. So as a BA, you start with requirements. You collect requirements, you do the documentation, and then in some cases you would get a sign-off from the client on the documentation that you've just created, and then you move on to the next phase, which is design. And then again, for design, you would create a visual documentation that is later going to be used by the developer. You might get a sign-off from the client as well. And then you move to the next phase, which is a development phase. And this is a phase where the BA is working together with a developer, and BA is just making sure that all the functional requirements are currently integrated with the solution that the developer is building. And then as soon as you do that, you move to the next phase, testing. And this is where the business analyst is creating testing documentation, conducting tests, and bring like some of the teammates, a project team on board to conduct testing. And then after that step is done, you go on to the maintenance step where you have some training documentation, you have a meeting with the client, you train the client on how to use new systems, new softwares, and then you close the project.
Okay, great. I've received a few questions here from our team. The first one is, when would you choose a sequential process like waterfall over Agile?
Sure. Well, first of all, it depends on what kind of project you're working on. So just because waterfall emphasizes the design and development phase, it means that in waterfall, it takes you longer to design and then develop something. Whereas in Agile, the work is just created, everything's created so quickly, and then it could be switched around based on the other needs or the feedback that you get. So with waterfall, if you have a client who knows exactly what they want, you can proceed with the waterfall methodology. But then also another thing that I wanted to mention is that Agile methodology is not going to work for every project. So you might have a construction project, right? And then with a construction project, you would need to build a building, but you wouldn't use agile methodology because who would build a roof without building the first floors or doors? So it all depends on the project.
Okay, great. I received a couple of questions here while you were speaking. The first one is from Yasadi. He asked, how important is it for a BA to have subject matter experience while working on technical projects? Will this experience help the BA on the project?
For sure. As I've mentioned before, business analysts, they are valid for their expertise or knowledge, right? And if you don't have the necessary technical knowledge, you would have to acquire it, because how are you going to be successful at helping the client to achieve the desired outcomes if you don't know how to use the system in the first place? And then if you don't know the system in the first place, you're not going to be able to create good documentation. So sometimes when business analysts do not have experience of working with like technology tools or softwares, what they have to do prior to a project is take some time, learn this new system or new tool, do some research, experiment with it, do some, I don't know, demos, test it out, and then when they acquire knowledge, they can take on a project and be an active participant and help to drive the project.
Okay. A few more questions here. Ravid writes, is Agile better than Waterfall?
Well, we can't really say that one framework is better than the other, and it ultimately depends on your client needs and requirements. And if you have a client, for example, for Agile, it's good when you have a client who's not entirely sure what they want to get. So you can work with the client, give different iterations of some small parts of the project, and then start from there. And then if you're working in Waterfall, you should have a client who knows what they want, because without it, you can't start doing the documentation. So it all depends on the need of the client and the project needs, and business analysts sometimes advise clients on which methodologies to use depending on what the end goal of the project is. Okay.
I have one question from my side here. I just want to know, what are some common features that are shared between the Waterfall and Agile methodologies?
Sure. So both of these methodologies, they follow the software development lifecycle. And within both of these methodologies, business analysts essentially keep doing the same thing. They gather requirements, they do some documentation, they design, test, train. And that's how it happens within both of the methodologies. But the ways of getting to the final stage are different, because Waterfall emphasizes that the development is going to take some time, but then in the end you're going to get the whole product, whereas in Agile, work is going to be delivered in small increments, and then it's going to be delivered step by step, and then it's going to be a part of the bigger picture.
Okay, great. So I don't have any more questions for now if you want to continue on.
Sure. And then I also want to talk about different challenges that business analysts face. And the first one is stakeholder issues. And sometimes when you work with business stakeholders, it's difficult to drive engagement from their side. And we had a project where our stakeholder wasn't involved in the project. He wouldn't contribute to it. And we already had our team and developers working on the final product. So from our side, we're just putting a lot of effort and time into it, but the stakeholder wasn't engaging in it at all. So one way around it was to understand what other business stakeholders from the client's team are going to be interested in taking over this project and become active contributors. So that's exactly what we did. We just brought other stakeholders on board. And then another common challenge is just scope creep. This is something that all of us are familiar with. Sometimes you start working on a project and you have your requirements, but then as the project progresses, your business stakeholders would come up to you and they would start asking for new functionalities to be added. And one way of dealing with it would be just to go back to the initial documentation, business requirements documentation, functional design documentation, and show the business stakeholder that the work that they're asking to do is outside of scope, and it's not a part of the bigger picture, meaning it's not a part of the final solution. That's why it shouldn't be in there. And then another challenge is just some issues that are related to solutions. And this is a common challenge that business analysts have, because if business analysts are not able to draft good documentation, or if they're not able to communicate with the project team and the client team effectively, then they're going to miss some important information. And when they miss this information, the final solution is not going to be satisfactory for the client. And one way for business analysts to overcome this challenge is always stay on top of their documentation, always ask clarifying questions, and always make sure that you bring your project team and the client team on the same page so there's no misalignment between the two. And the last challenge is just implementing change. And people are resistant to change. No one likes change. And sometimes you would have projects with business stakeholders who do not approve of the things that you're suggesting to implement for them. And one way of overcoming would be just to do your research. Understand what is currently happening in the market, what are your clients, competitors are doing, and just utilize all of this knowledge that you acquire from the outside and use it in convincing the client to proceed forward. Because in the end, you're trying to bring a positive change to a client's business. And sometimes you just need to push your client to be more creative and provide them with more information and tools to help them reimagine how their business could look like in the future.
Okay, so we got a few questions here. The first one is, why is it important to ensure that you are working according to the Master Service Agreement and Statement of Work?
So it's important because these documents essentially they serve as a contract between a client and the project team. So if anything goes wrong, or if your team is delivering something and the client comes back to you and says, oh, this is not something I've asked for, and there's just some confusion up there, you just take these documents and present it to the client. And then also another thing that could happen is that in some projects, before moving on to the next stage, you have to, there are some payment terms. So for example, when you're doing the business requirements document, you have to do the document, get the client sign off. And if the client finds everything satisfactory, they would give you a sign off. They would pay you a small portion of the project or whatever you agreed on, and then the project proceeds into the next stage.
Okay, got a few questions here. The next question I have is, what will be the role of a BA during performance testing?
So during the performance testing, BAs are responsible for seeing how the system that was designed performs overall. So, and in the performance testing, you just want to see that all of the functional requirements that the client wants to have, they are up there and they're performing as expected, as well as some of the issues, some of the aspects could also include some design features. And basically what BA does for performance testing is they're seeing how the testing goes if, let's say, you were to roll out this product, how the new system is going to perform in the real world scenarios, and how good is it performing? Is it performing according to a client needs and requirements? If yes, then good. If not, then you would have to go back to your development team and figure out a way of how to do a better job of delivering on what you promised to deliver to a client.
Okay, I have one question from my end here. What is the most challenging aspect of being a business analyst, and how do you overcome this challenge, Camila?
I think the most difficult challenge is dealing with stakeholders, because you never know what kind of business stakeholder you're gonna see on your project, and there are different types of people that you meet throughout the project engagement, and you have to figure out, find different ways of dealing with these people and what is the best way to approach them. So one of the examples that we had is we had a stakeholder who was bringing others business stakeholders into the project, and there were a bunch of people within the project, and all of them had different needs or wants, and a lot of things were falling outside of the scope. So what we did is we tried to raise some urgency, and we stressed the importance of deadlines and what is going to be delivered, and we just pushed them towards making some business decisions that helped us to move the project further and make sure that we deliver the project successfully.
Okay, I got one other question here. How would you help a client who has difficulty adopting to a new product, i.e. the new technology that you guys are implementing?
Well, the best way to help a client is have face-to-face trainings. And I know because of COVID, this is not something that that is possible right now, but you can have meetings with a client over Teams or over any other tool that allows you to conduct meetings, and just make sure that you have very good documentation with a lot of instructions, but then also engage your client. You have to understand what are the client technology skills are like, and if they're not in the right place, you have to train your client and make sure that whatever skills they have right now, you're going to get them to the right level so that whatever work you and your team created is not going to be wasted, and the client will become familiar with the new system. So the more activities you engage with the client and training, the more interactive things or just like assessments you give to your client and see how the client is working around with the solution and what's happening, the more chances of success you can have with the client and the successful adoption from the client side.
Okay, great. It looks like I got one last question here. They write, what should a BA do when there is a scope creep?
When there's a scope creep, you have to understand, first of all, you have to go back to the documentation, because for a functional design document or like business requirements document, you would have in scope and out of scope activities or functionalities. So you make sure that if it's not falling under in scope, then you wouldn't proceed with implementing the requested functionality. And sometimes you also have scope documents, which are just like summaries of the things that are summary of functionalities that are within the scope. And if it falls outside of the scope, you would have to first talk with the project manager and then figure a way of communicating your concern to the client and just explaining that this cannot be done within this phase of the project because we're already moving into different things. We're moving along the project, and we cannot do it for you right now because we have agreed that we're not going to do it in the first place.
Okay. I got a follow-up question here. Kriska writes, at what point do you decide to suggest outside training versus giving supplemental training yourself?
Outside training? Well, what do you mean by that?
I believe what they're saying is like that you outsource the training outside of your company already.
Well, from my point of view, I think there's no point of doing outside training because you and your team were the ones who created the solution. And you also have developers who worked on implementing and developing the solution. So no one's gonna know the solution better than your team. And you wouldn't outsource it to someone else unless you had other parties who were engaged in the project and it was a collective effort. But if you and your development team were the only ones who worked on the project and they're the only responsible party, then they should be able to conduct training with the client without bringing any outside resources.
Yeah, I agree with that point, Camila. So I think that will conclude the webinar portion of our Q&A today. So Camila, thank you for this informative webinar on business analyst framework and methodologies. And thank you everyone for joining in and asking engaging questions. If you want to learn more about our services, please follow us on LinkedIn, email us at contact@braunweiss.net, or visit our website, www.braunweiss.net. The Q&A chat, we'll keep it open for a next couple of minutes here in case anyone wants to have some last minute questions. Okay, so Camille, I received one other question here. Lakshmi writes, what documentation is written by a BA in projects?
Yeah, so going back to one of the slides that I was talking about in the beginning, BAs are responsible for the requirements documents. They're also responsible for visual documents that they create utilizing different software tools. They are also responsible for writing some testing documents. But then if you're bringing an outside party, if you're bringing a quality assurance team who's going to be doing the quality testing, they're going to bring their own documentation. So the BAs are not responsible for that. However, like the rest of the testing, the scripts, and different scenarios and cases, BAs are responsible for that. And then they're also responsible for training materials as well.
Great. So I don't have any more questions from our side. Again, thank you so much, Camila, and thank you everyone for attending. This has been a great webinar, and stay safe.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Chetan, and thanks to everyone who joined us today, and have a great rest of your day.